leading lights in our criminal and social justice research cluster here at the School of Social Work and Social Policy in Strathclyde. And Cara is herself a senior lecturer here and does a wealth of research into the impact of imprisonment on families and communities, social justice and inequalities, using a variety of methods which span sort of qualitative and creative methods. And I'm pleased to introduce her seminar today and to chair that seminar. So if we can post questions as you want, as you go along in the chat function, and I'll keep a track. But otherwise, if you'd like to pose any questions, if we could keep those until after the seminar presentation has concluded. And if everybody could keep themselves on mute, because this is being recorded for posterity. So in this seminar, what Cara's going to do is really explore the concept of what community means to people who are imprisoned. And in particular, she's going to look at how imprisoned people relate to communities, both within prison and outside of prison. But she's also going to explore how criminal justice involvement in itself changes how people connect to their communities. And she's going to argue that these questions are really important if we're going to fully understand how the punitive nature of imprisonment is experienced and the wider implications for justice, fairness, and social belonging. And with that, I'm pleased to hand you over to Cara.
All right, thanks so much, Beth, for such a lovely introduction, and thank you to Gillian for organising the series, and yeah, thanks to everyone who is here on their lunchtime. I know for the academics it's marking season, so thank you very much for being here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to talk for about 35-40 minutes, so there'll be some time for questions at the end. And I'm just going to share my screen. So we should be able to get started. Okay. So as Beth said, one of my sort of key research interests is the impact of imprisonment on people in prison, also in their families and also their communities. So I'm going to be talking a little bit today about some early findings from my current project, which is a Leverhulme postdoctoral fellowship, which should be officially ending this month. So this is very much a work in progress. So I'm really pleased to be here today to get some of these ideas sort of out of my head and down on paper or out to an audience. I'll be really interested in kind of questions and comments people have. So I'll just start with a little bit of a background, particularly for the non-criminologists in the room. When people think, write and teach about prisons and their relationship to the community, sort of a real canonical or classic touchstone in the criminological literature is the work of Irving Goffman and his classic text, Asylums, which was published in 1961. And it's a series of essays, really, Asylums. And here, Goffman describes and starts to flesh out the concept of the prison and other institutions as total institutions. So he's interested in organizations of control, like prisons, but also organizations that are more about care and control, like children's homes and asylums, and also sort of working institutions like military barracks, and also religious institutions. And he's interested in these spaces and places because they're very closed off and they're routinized and they're bureaucratic. And I think the reason that his writings continue to appeal to criminologists is, one, he writes beautifully and everybody loves Goffman, but also he's very good at setting out the sort of mortifications that a person goes through when they enter the prison as a total institution and the implications of those indignities for people and their sense of self. So while that's a very common starting point, we also know that prisons are not entirely total institutions. And it's really been convincingly argued by others that the critiques of Goffman, so Goffman's being critiqued for overstating how total and isolated these institutions are, that some of these critiques maybe don't engage with how nuanced his original writing was, and he never intended to say they are completely cut off from society. But the broader point here is we now have multiple examples of how the community and prison overlap when we think of the contemporary prison, and how things like community projects, I've got some examples on the slide. So a really famous one is people in the Edinburgh prison refurbished and made a community bus, which is now a mobile community centre. You can buy works of art made in prison through the Costello Trust, and also the example of that embroidery there is through Find Sell Work. So if you ever need a gift for someone, you can visit their online shop, which has lots of lovely things in it. During the pandemic, people in prison were given mobile phones as a way to stay in contact, and also a really obvious example was prison staff come in and out of prisons all the time. So the boundary between prisons and community is quite blurry, and how that is understood and traversed is of increasing interest to criminologists. But I think something that we don't really know is how these sort of multiple, some big, some small connections to community, how those in their totality is experienced by people in prison. And there's some interesting work on open prisons that suggests that while these might seem, and particularly open prisons in Scandinavia, which are sort of widely regarded as more humane and more modern, that actually these environments can still be experienced as really punitive, because having access to freedom highlights exactly what you don't have. So I was really interested in how these sort of, what I've called these sort of corners of community, these ways that the outside enters the prison, how they're experienced in their totality, whether they make things easier for people, whether they make things harder, what people think about them while they're there, and what the broader implications of all of this are for citizenship, legitimacy, for people when they return to their communities. So that was the project as it was originally conceived. As I said, this is coming to the end of just over a 3-year project. And my original methods, I had planned to do repeated interviews with men and women in custody. I had planned to do quite prolonged periods of observation of community based out, or of things where people would have the opportunity to connect to community. So visits, education, work, religious activities and services. These were the types of things that I was planning to spend quite a lot of time in the prison observing. And I was also going to do some one-off interviews with prison staff and other professionals working in the prison. So that was my plan. On the 16th of March, I was in Edinburgh prison doing my induction, doing my key training. The prison had been incredibly supportive and open to having me there, and they were really just going to let me come and do whatever I wanted. And then a week later, I'm sure no one needs reminded, what happened in March 2020 is we all went into lockdown. So I had to really rejig and redesign this project to think about how can I still learn about a concept like community, which is quite difficult to pin down, highly contested in the academic literature, maybe quite difficult for people to articulate and verbalize, like how can I, and that's why I had wanted this project to have observation and to be ethnographic. How can I still do that when we can't go anywhere? So really my fieldwork overlapped with the peak of lockdown. So nobody could go anywhere and do anything. Using tools like Zoom and Teams in the prison is challenging. At the time that I was thinking about how do I redesign this project, video visits and mobile phones, none of that was up and running yet. So the SPS, as I said, were incredibly supportive of this project, and their suggestion for taking it forward was to think about what paper-based methods I could use. And their suggestion was, why don't you do a questionnaire? We could support, say, 60 questionnaires being distributed in one prison, and from that you'll get about 12 returns. So I was really pleased that they were still happy to support the project. I actually thought about whether or not continuing with the project was an appropriate thing to do for quite a long time. But I did feel like there was quite a big gulf between what I'd originally set out to do, which was 18 months of sort of focus observation and repeated interviews, and then potentially 12 questionnaire returns. So I had a bit of time to think and did a bit of research into what other methods I could use. And I settled on adopting this approach of cultural probes, which are more commonly used in art and design. And really what they want to do is prioritize the perceptions of your participants by asking them to self-document their experiences over a period of time. So for people with art and design, working in art and design, they might give them a product and ask them to document their sort of feelings, emotions, experiences. And you could do that in various ways through like diary keeping or map making or using cameras and photography. So obviously not all of that can work in a prison environment. Giving people cameras is probably not going to be viable, but I found this broad approach really useful. And what I did was I made up a set of research packs, which contained a series of activities for people to engage with as much or as little as they wanted to. So I had quite a structured questionnaire, and I had 2 really short postcards with very concise writing prompts, 2 longer writing prompts, which gave people a whole page to reflect on. So one of the questions I asked, is it better to keep your head in the jail? I gave people diary pages. I also gave them picture boards, and I gave them a whole heap of prepaid envelopes so that taking part wouldn't cost them anything. I launched the packs with a video, which was really, really helpful, that could be played on the Prison Information channel, which really helped me to get across. There's quite a lot of written information in this research pack, along with information sheets and consent forms and covering letters from the SPS. So the video was a really helpful resource for explaining, sort of informed consent, what the ethical concerns might be, and really getting across to people that there was no right or wrong way to participate, that they could do as many of the activities they wanted or as few, and that, they could write back and tell me that I'd really missed the point and that I was asking stupid questions. I really welcomed all of that. And when I was designing the activities that went into the pack, they're all informed by different conceptualizations of community. And that took quite a long time because I wanted to give some sort of framework for people to talk about this quite contested concept, but without imposing what I think community means on people. So in sum, this method worked quite well. This is the first time I've done research like this in the prison. I put 60 packs into one prison, and instead of the 12 responses the SPS suggested I might get, 35 people participated in some way. I received more than 200 pieces of correspondence. I was able to engage with both men and women, which I was really pleased about. The majority of participants were men, 20 men, 14 women, and 1 non-binary participant. I had a mix of ages, although only one of my participants is under 25, and participants are serving a range of sentences, including short sentences under 4 years, long-term sentence over 4 years, and also some serving life sentences or on remand. So if you were doing a pure kind of cultural probes methodology, you'd really want to give your participants the packs or activities that you want to do, and then you would probably have interviews or focus groups with them to discuss how they found that and pull out some of the findings. That's been quite challenging. As I said, I had redesigned this at the peak of the pandemic when nobody was going anywhere, and also services like the prison service were under quite a lot of pressure. So that wasn't immediately possible. I have now managed to do one focus group with women in the prison, so some of whom had been involved in the first round of the research and some of whom hadn't, hoping to do another focus group with men. But as I said, this has all been quite challenging to do in COVID context. So all of that is by way of a bit of background, and I'm very happy in the Q&A if people want to ask me questions about the methods and the strengths and limitations of these. what I'm going to do for the rest of the time that I have is really talk about some initial findings that speak to the first aim of the research, which was this question of what does community mean to people in prison. And I think the first thing to say about that is that there was a general consensus amongst the participants that it's really important to feel part of the community. And so that 85% comes from questionnaire respondents. So of the 35 people who completed the questionnaire, a large majority of them felt that it was important to be part of a community. And this was echoed in the focus group that I did with women, which there's some extracts on that slide where they're saying, you know, it's really important to have people that stand by you. It gives you security and the feeling that you're placed somewhere. But I have to caveat that finding that community was felt to be really important with the sort of more nuanced point, I guess, that isn't to say that people were universally positive about community and their experiences of it. So one of the activities in the pack was a postcard that asked people to sum up their experiences of community in 3 words. And the majority of people did use quite positive words to sum up their experiences of community. They used words like security, friends, family, belonging. But people also had really negative experiences that they conveyed in that, like shithole, drugs, and death, or more ambivalent experiences of community, which you also see on the slide with participant 17, saying to them community is unsure, uncertain, disconnected. So I think these answers convey experiences of trauma and stigma and isolation, which really powerfully illustrate why we shouldn't think about community just in an idealized way of something that's always accepting and welcoming and provides a sense of belonging. So as I said, when I talked about methods, I asked people about what community meant to them in various different ways, through like longer writing prompts and these short postcards and the questionnaire. So I'm just showing you a little slice of the data here, which is from the questionnaire, to illustrate a finding that runs through the materials that were returned to me, that community didn't just hold one meaning for participants. So I asked them in the questionnaire, are there things that you need to do to feel part of the community? And I've ranked their responses. So most commonly people said, you need to live in the community, but you also need to be welcomed, you need to know people, you need to be helped. And then less than half of participants talked about working and volunteering, knowing the stories, being part of groups, and interestingly, voting, which we typically associate with citizenship, was really low down. I'm going to come back to that towards the end. And this idea of community as having multiple meanings and being also, these multiple meanings intersecting also came through the focus group. So people talked about you need some sort of sense of place to facilitate the connections to people, which are important. So focus group participants talked about being like growing up in quite small communities where everybody knows each other, or the importance of a pub or a hairdresser's or a community centre or a shopping precinct, which facilitates these sort of everyday interactions and really informal interactions that kind of foster these feelings of relationality and belonging. And in the focus group as well, people talked a lot about how community had changed. And often that was because of the loss of these sort of central places in communities. So pubs shutting down or community centres shutting down and there being nowhere for children and young people to go. So this sense of change wasn't just limited to people's perception of what community was like. Their own relationships with community also changed over the course of their sentence. And this was really interesting finding in the questionnaire analysis, that people were quite evenly divided, in that 14 people told me that they felt more part of the community in prison than they did before their sentence, while 15 people said, I feel less part of the community now that I'm in prison than I did when I was outside. And only a minority of participants, so for 6 people, their sense of belonging to community stayed the same, both before and after sentence. And there were some quite stark differences between these groups, which I'm going to talk a little bit about. So for the people who said, I feel less part of the community now that I'm in prison, these people did have difficult life experiences. It's well established in the literature around prisons and prison sociology that very often people in prison have difficult life experiences, including school exclusion, bereavement, homelessness, addiction, physical health problems, mental health problems. So this group did report difficulties in their lives, but they also have positive things to say about their lives outside. And you can see in these little extracts, people said things like, there is more to life than jail. This is just a short chapter in my life. I have everything I need outside. So they were more positive about their lives in the community. And they wrote more about how, now that they were in prison, they felt really disconnected from that this separation from their life outside was really painful, that they felt really stigmatized. So they said things like, nothing in prison makes you feel connected to the outside. You know, I would give anything to have my freedom. I don't have my family, and that's what hurts the most. People might look at you differently, and you might not be accepted when you are released. And they also, alongside that, they either separated themselves by saying, I'm different from everybody else here, or they felt that they were excluded from the community within prison. So one says, I do not feel valued by the prison community. I feel I'm mocked. And they were also more critical about the criminal justice system. So this were the only group where people said, my conviction is a miscarriage of justice. The criminal justice system is unfair. I've been let down. The system is corrupt. The prison is corrupt. So they were much more critical about the criminal justice system. In comparison, people who said, I feel more part of the community now that I'm here than I did when I was outside, they also had difficult backgrounds, but they were much more likely to write about how this had shaped their sense of community. So it's really evident in this quote here from one participant who says, I've been coming to Scottish prisons and young offenders since I was 15. Although I was born in Edinburgh, I was brought up in Glasgow due to child safeguarding. I've had the experience of Scottish prisons for 33 years of my life. I'm not yet 50. I'm estranged from my family. I'm divorced from my ex-wife, and my sense of community reflects these experiences. So alongside having the sense that things in their background had shaped their experience of community, this group it was only this group that talked about prison as being, if not necessarily preferable, but certainly easier, or not being able to cope with life outside in the community. And there were numerous examples of this. So one participant said, I'd only been liberated 5 days prior to committing this offence. I do not feel I've been rehabilitated. I've been in prison more than 10 times since I was 16. Or I'm here on recall, and I was only out in the community for 6 days before I was recalled because I couldn't cope. And there's real connection here with recent work by Margaret Schinkel at Glasgow, who's been looking at the experience of repeated short-term sentences. And she argues that people can come to experience these as kind of both easier and safer than life outside. Although when they reflect back on their life as a whole, it really feels like a whole life wasted, that they don't get much pleasure or satisfaction from this, but prison becomes the place they feel more belonging than they do outside. And this sense of being stuck in the system was also raised by my participants, particularly where they were facing new charges or a period of uncertainty, not knowing what's going to happen on release or potential for recall. So one participant saying, I'm facing fresh charges related to things that happened in prison. I feel like the criminal justice system is like an octopus just pulling me back all the time. I feel completely disconnected from society and the community. I don't know what the outcome of these cases is going to be, and that makes it hard for me to maintain community links. So for this group of participants, the criminal justice system was a real factor that made them feel disconnected and stigmatized from the community outside, which also created a sense of, if not belonging, but just sort of acceptance of, I feel more part of something inside because it's so hard to connect with outside. Okay, so think about some implications of this. So far, I've set out to make kind of 3 key arguments in this paper. The first being that community and feeling a part of it matters to people in prison. I think that's really important. I've wanted to argue that community is not just one thing, and that feeling part of a community comes both from a sense of connection to place and also relationships which foster belonging, and also being a bigger part of something, whether that's work or volunteering or groups or community groups. And then the third point that I want to make is that prison can make people feel both more and less part of a community. So less part of a community outside and more part of a community inside. I think there are real implications here regarding resettlement, and I think that people can feel both more and less part of a community are actually both really concerning in terms of resettlement. So for the people who felt less part of a community inside, they were the people who had more positive connections with outside, but part of what they found painful about prison was that those connections were damaged. And for people who felt more part of a community, that they're not saying that I feel more part of a community outside, they're saying I feel more part of a community in prison, but going alongside that is this sense of it's a wasted life, I'm not particularly happy or fulfilled, I feel institutionalized, I feel stigmatized, I feel lesser. And this creates real difficulties, I think, for the SPS. So I've put the Scottish Prison Service mission statement on this slide, that their aim as an organisation is to transform the lives of people in our care so they can fulfil their potential and become responsible citizens. And I think this feeling of connections to the community outside being broken down and a closeness to an institutionalized community potentially growing, that creates real problems for this aspiration of we want people to return to their communities and make positive contributions. And I think this is particularly the case given that a repeated thread through the data that I did get was about the lack of rehabilitation, which was quite interesting because it's not something I asked directly about, but you've seen it in the previous quotes where people have said I couldn't cope with outside, I keep coming back to prison, prison does nothing for me, but also in these extracts here where people say there's no rehabilitation in jail, there's no help, there's no attempt at a rehabilitation effort, you don't get any help or support, you just have to do everything yourself. And to be really clear, I don't think this is a Scottish problem. This is a great quote from Maguire and Rayner, just saying, achieving effective rehabilitation and resettlement of prisoners is a goal which has eluded almost all penal systems throughout their history. So I don't think it's a uniquely Scottish problem. And this is why I put in my abstract, I think one of the implications of findings like this is that we really need to think much more profoundly about what prisons are for and what they can do and what the limits of that might be. So I think there's some really important policy and practice implications in this, but I also think there are some important theoretical implications. And as I said, I'm sort of in the middle of doing the analysis and write-up just now, so I've really enjoyed the opportunity to put this paper together, but I've been trying to think conceptually beyond what can I say that is not just saying meanings of community are individual, contested, complicated, changing, shifting. So I want to be able to say something bigger than that. And in doing that, I've found some writings on the ordinary or banal nature of citizenship really, really useful. And there's kind of 2 key groups of authors whose work I found really inspiring here, one of which is Gillian McIntyre and colleagues, who is here. And and also the work of Stehelli and colleagues. And Stehelli argues that community is the contested terrain through which citizenship is constructed and reworked. And I think that idea that citizenship and community are sort of intermeshed and intermingled, and that you have to traverse community as people try and construct their identities as citizens is really, really important. McIntyre and her team of authors, what they were looking to do is do community-based participatory research with people who had and hadn't experienced some level of marginalization or life disruption, to better understand what citizenship actually means to people and how it connects and coheres to their everyday life and their everyday experience. And having done multiple rounds of community-based research with over 70 participants, they argue that we need to account for the everyday nature of citizenship, and that this has sort of 5 key clusters, which I've outlined on the slide there. So one is around building relationships, which speaks to belonging and having friends and caring for others, repairing damaged relationships and getting support for peers. The second is acceptance and autonomy, which includes things like not being stigmatized, having some level of privacy, being able to build a positive identity, access to supports and services, shared values and social roles, so things like being a good neighbor or living harmoniously with others, and civic rights and responsibilities, so things like paying your taxes, not breaking the law, building a better future for your children. And I think this coheres really well with Stehelli's later work with colleagues, where they are arguing for the importance of what they call ordinary citizenship. And what they're really interested in is the intersection between law and policy and how that is lived in the daily experiences of citizens. And they argue that this means we have to pay attention to relationships, encounters, practices, and affective feelings, but also space and location. And in this article, they're interested in migration and the rights and what rights are withheld to migrant and immigrant communities. But also I think this emphasis on space and location speaks really well to the experience of people in prison who see their relationship with citizenship and community shift as they move from the prison to the community. And also given that my participants put so much emphasis on place, and as that being something that was the foundation for relationships, acceptance, and shared roles. So I think together, these theoretical frameworks that both argue for the importance of paying attention to the ordinary really speak to the concerns of my participants and the things that they were trying to articulate when I asked them, what do you mean by community? The other reasons that I find this way of theorizing community as something that has to be traversed to achieve citizenship, and thinking of citizenship as something that is quite ordinary, is I think this is quite an assets-based way of thinking about citizenship. Rather than saying citizenship is something that must be achieved through your rehabilitation, or citizenship is something that we can award or re-award when you return to the community, it's thinking about citizenship as something that is constantly negotiated and can potentially constantly be achieved. And I think that's really helpful when thinking about the people who are in prison and the backgrounds of marginality that they often come with. I also think that the emphasis on shared values and roles and civic rights and responsibilities means that this framework speaks to the concerns of multiple actors. So I think it maps really well onto the things that my participants want to convey when I ask them, what does community mean to you? But it also speaks to the concerns of the prison. It speaks to the concerns of policymakers, to communities, to victims, to sentencers, because having people living peacefully with others, or being a good neighbor, or giving back, those are things that everybody is concerned with. And I think that is really useful, because I think a conceptual framework that speaks to the concerns of multiple audiences, I would like to hope maybe that this would encourage a more honest conversation about what prison can actually achieve. So I know that I've covered quite a lot in that one slide. So I'm going to try and flesh out what I mean here by applying this to one of my participants. So we've heard a little bit from this participant before. He's one who said, I've been coming to prison for over 30 years and it's not made any difference to me other than I'm now estranged from my family. So this participant's a man, he's middle-aged, he's coming to the end of a short sentence. He's going to be released a few weeks after. He's writing to me. He's going to be homeless. He doesn't know where he'll live. He doesn't know where he'll get his methadone. He's asked for support with his benefit entitlements because he doesn't know what will happen with them. But the prison officer who is responsible for through care said that they don't know anything about benefits. So they're feeling quite stuck. So if we were thinking about what ordinary citizenship might look for this person, we might think about how do we build meaningful relationships that foster a sense of belonging? So can family relationships be repaired rather? Or is it a case of connecting to community organizations? Are there peer-led organizations that might be important here? If we think about acceptance and autonomy, we might think around what are the social attitudes that people will encounter to somebody with a criminal record and somebody with an addiction? How can you foster a more positive individual identity of somebody who can succeed, right? So he says, it feels like I'm on a treadmill or a merry-go-round. I owe the community for my crimes, but I can't pay the community back. I don't feel like I've got the necessary power to succeed. So how do you change that? We'd also have to think about access to services and supports. So if we were saying what prison is supposed to do is to return citizens, and citizenship has these characteristics, it just wouldn't be acceptable to be releasing somebody homeless with no money, with no support, and no medication, right? That just becomes unacceptable in that framework. If we pay attention to shared values and social roles, this participant is expressing a want and a motivation to give back or to repair. So how might we do that? How can we support that? And how can we prevent future harms to the community? So, and this is where I find bringing Stiheli's work in useful. What are the intersections between law and the everyday? Are the intersections between the law and the everyday, do they prevent some of that giving back? If we think about requirements on disclosure or limits on volunteering. We could also think about the intersection between law and the everyday and how they've shaped people's background, right? So this is one of the participants who'd been in care as a child. How has that shaped people's background and what reparations might they be due? And we can also think about space and place. How much of this can be done in prison and how much can't, and how much can be done in the community, and how much can be done in communities that people in prison commonly come from and return to that experience high levels of poverty, marginality, and austerity. So I think these are really legitimate concerns that this framework speaks to. And I think what another reason why it has real value is by clustering these dimensions of ordinary citizenship, as McIntyre and her team have, is it shows you that these goals are unlikely to be achieved in isolation, right? So giving back and preventing harm to the community, these are goals that are broadly supported across everyone with an interest in criminal justice. But I think it forces recognition that this is really unlikely to be achieved if you have someone whose housing, health, and financial needs are not being addressed. So I think it provides possibly a platform for action, but also where this conversation might go, and I'd be interested to hear what people think about this, does it also prompt a more honest conversation about whether or not it is a legitimate, reasonable, or even possible aim for prisons to say that they're going to transform or return responsible citizens? Should we just say, given the limits of how people can engage with ordinary citizenship while in custody, actually the best that prisons can do is perhaps speak to one of these, like perhaps they can offer some form of access to service and supports, but really they're very unlikely to be able to achieve all of these clustered aims. And therefore, we really need to recognise that and be more upfront about it. And really, that's all I wanted to say. I'm going to end it there. I'll stop sharing. And yeah, I'd be really interested to hear people's thoughts.